Francisco, 1934. A battleground. It was a war between striking longshoremen and the owners of the ships whose cargo had to be moved. The fight was led by a man from Australia who went on to lead one of the most powerful left-wing unions in the country for nearly half a century. His name was Harry Bridges.
I wouldn't say it was a matter of being indignant or outraged. I was taking care of myself. To take care of myself, I had to line up with other people and to help take care of them was one of those things. You had a slogan, Workers of the World Unite. It's still a good slogan. It's an old Marxist slogan. I still use it. And that's how simple it was. Workers of the world unite. You got nothing to lose but your change. Still as good as the day it was said. We still operate by it. At least I try to.
Harry Bridges was born in Melbourne, Australia in 1901. His father was a prosperous real estate broker. He was the oldest of 5 children and brought up in the Catholic Church. He was an altar boy for a few years. After he finished high school, his father pressured him to join the family business, but the young man resisted. He'd read a lot of adventure stories by Jack London and wanted to go to sea instead. At the age of 16, Harry left home and set sail. For the next 5 years, he roamed ports all over the world. He saw poverty, degradation, injustice everywhere he went. But nowhere were maritime conditions as bad as he found on the San Francisco waterfront, where he came ashore in 1922. And found work as a longshoreman. Dock workers, called wharf rats, were miserably underpaid and exploited. They often worked 24 to 72 hours at a stretch. The employers hired men in a shape-up, a system that involved kickbacks to the foreman, and pitted workers against each other just to get a job.
All right, let it go, Tony.
It was used on the New York waterfront as well.
Anybody want to work today? Yeah. Yeah, you.
Hey, what do you see to get a day's pay around?
Give me a break, Mac. I got a couple of kids.
Hey, Mac,
Gosh, that was one of the big complaints. That was a shape-up system. I used to work 7 days, 7 nights a week, year after year after year, on various organizing things, you see. I wanted a good job and good pay and a house and medical care. And the way to get it was if this made sense. That if all the people in the world had it, why, I'd get my share, that was all.
When he came to this country from Australia, he already had a kind of an Aussie point of view about the difference between the master class and the slave class, the owning class and the working class. He had some pretty strong socialist ideas that he brought with him from Australia. It was much more common in parts of the British Empire at that point. But when he got here, he had a kind of an instinct for leadership among workers.
By 1934, Harry Bridges, working with the help of the Communist Party, had built a power base that enabled the longshoremen to take on the employers. Dock workers were fed up with the brutal working conditions. They wanted decent wages, a normal working day, and most of all, a hiring hall that would eliminate the corruption of the shape-up. On May 9th of that year, 50,000 longshoremen and dock workers walked off the job, tying up every Pacific Coast port from San Diego to Seattle.
As to those in this city who willfully seek to prolong strife, either for their own selfish ends or for the overthrow of this government and of the government of the United States, all of the forces at my command will be brought to bear to prevent their carrying out their plan.
The ship owners were absolutely convinced that they were the shock troops of capitalism in a fight to the finish against communism. And they had no trouble getting the police to protect their interests against the striking longshoremen. Harry Bridges, as chairman of the strike committee, worked quietly behind the scenes, planning strategy with the rank and file. The ship owners imported strike breakers from all over the country. On July 5th, 1934, when these men tried to open the port, a war began. Pitched battles raged up and down the waterfront. Hundreds were arrested and injured, and 2 men were killed, both shot in the back.
I have ordered the National Guard of California to move into San Francisco strike area to safeguard lives, to protect state property, and to preserve order.
On July 9th, Howard S. Sperry, a striking longshoreman, and Nicholas Bordoise, an unemployed cook, were given a funeral the likes of which had never been seen in San Francisco. Over 40,000 people lined the streets to watch the longshoremen honor their dead. The public's reaction to this funeral was astounding. When a general strike was called the next day, the entire city came to a halt in support of the longshoremen.
The year was one of violent labor troubles and strikes. San Francisco's general strike gripped the city in a death-like clutch. A gasoline shortage stopped almost every wheeling town. Everyone walked or stayed at home. Serious clashes claimed many victims. Business was paralyzed and hunger threatened the city.
Nobody believed that these workers could do anything. There had been strike after strike in the city where things were not achieved. The decisive force in the 34 strike was the rank and file, who in spite of red baiting, in spite of every kind of scurrilous attack, stood by, stood fast, and did not go back to work. The strike was never broken. And each one of them had to go home every night and figure, Jesus, can we keep this up? There was enormous pressure on those men. And all they had to go with was some Aussie called a communist who wasn't even a citizen.
He was offered money. I mean, they got around the waterfront that he was offered as much as $100,000. They could get the hell on a boat and go back to Australia. And he came up and even told the rank and file, they're sending the bitches to offer me money to leave town. You want me to take the $100,000 and give it to you guys for your soup kitchen and take off? They said no. They said no, you stay right where you are. The hell with the money.
Three months later, the strike was settled, and the longshoremen won the thing they wanted most, a hiring hall.
Ultimately, something truly revolutionary came out of these very simple guys on the waterfront, which was a contract in 1934, a contract which permitted them to have some true control over their work. over their jobs. A hiring hall, never had been thought of before, in which the union controlled the hiring hall, though the employer paid for the hiring hall, and that they would equalize the job so that everybody would have the same amount of work and theoretically earn the same amount of money at the end of a year. A whole new system of job control. That was one point. The other point was the fact of rank and file control over their own lives. This was visionary, and then it happened. No longer visionary, but a fact.
Now that the men have resumed work and are secure in their right to be hired from the hiring hall, and are back at work again, we feel that we have gained a big victory.
But no one, not even Bridges, could have foreseen the effect the hiring hall would have on the men. Once considered lowly wharf rats, they became known as Lords of the Docks. A mystique grew up around the union that endowed the men with a sense of pride and an esprit de corps unique in the history of organized labor. Harry Bridges, meanwhile, emerged as a powerful force in the American labor movement. He also became a figure of considerable celebrity, well beyond the waterfront, especially in Hollywood, where liberal members of the movie colony considered him an authentic working-class hero and sought his company. Harry liked the sort of attention. He also enjoyed dancing, nightclubs, and most of all, playing the horses. By the late 1930s, Bridges was appointed West Coast Director of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. His outfit was now called the International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union and had expanded to include men and women in other trades and regions. For this effort, Harry brought in a brilliant organizer, Lou Goldblatt, and together they formulated a policy that, unlike other unions, combined political goals with economic issues.
I'm an officer of a left-wing trade union, and that's the way those people think, and as long as my rank and file feel that way, my job is to represent them that way.
What do you mean by a left-wing trade union?
Well, obviously, on the record, it's a union that means that's willing to arbitrate. To start with. That's a matter of record. It's also a union that believes in a lot of rank-and-file democracy and control. It's a union, I'm giving you my definitions now of a left-wing union. It's a union that believes that its officers should be easy to remove and should function under a setup where their wages and expenses are no more than the highest paid at the most. The highest paid worker that's a member of the union. It's also a union that recognizes that from time to time it's got to stand up and fight for certain things that mightn't necessarily only be wages, hours, and conditions. Civil liberties, racial equality, and things like that.
The growing economic muscle of the longshoremen soon found political expression when in 1938 they refused to handle scrap iron bound for Japan.
When we shut down ships and we refused to ship oil and scrap iron to Japan when it invaded China, that was a very radical, revolutionary thing. I got a telegram from Mr. Roosevelt saying, hey, quit interfering in the good diplomatic relationships between two nations. Well, at the time. But we still shut down the ships. And we said at the time, that scrap iron is going to come back on the heads of American boys. It did at Pearl Harbor.
What you're doing when you do that is to interfere with the foreign policy of your country.
Sure as hell are. That's our job, that's our privilege, and that's our right, and that's our duty. Right.
By the end of the 30s, the ship owners wanted to get rid of Bridges. They realized that his belief in improving the lives of the rank and file wasn't just rhetoric. And they took action. They persuaded the government that his status as an alien and suspected communist was enough to hold deportation hearings against him. Charged with being a member of the Communist Party, Bridges prepared his defense team. Judge James Landis, Dean of Harvard Law School, would determine whether this tourist from Australia should be sent home forever.
The trial took place in Angel Island because I was such a dangerous character and fighting the Russian Revolution. It was too dangerous to hold that damn trial here in San Francisco.
Some people feared that if they didn't hold it out there, but instead held it in the federal building in San Francisco, the witnesses against Harry would be assaulted by communists, so they held it out there. You could only reach there by boat. When I read the transcript where he would be asked questions about, well, what do you think about communists and being members of your union? He'd say, generally speaking, they make good members. Once in a while, they get out of line, and when they do, I call up the Communist Party and tell them to straighten these guys out and remind them they're union members first and party members second. Well, those weren't popular answers in those days, and I actually found tears coming to my eyes as I read the candor with which he responded to the questions that anybody else would have run for cover when those questions were asked.
The prosecution surprised the courtroom by calling Bridges to the stand, thinking he might incriminate himself. The move backfired, as he proved to be a compelling witness. Judge Landis was so taken by Bridges that he engaged him in long philosophical discussions about the capitalist system, civil liberties, the influence of communists on unions, leaving the prosecution watching helplessly on the sidelines. Their efforts to prove Bridges' affiliation with the party were continually blunted by his honesty. As one reporter wrote, Bridges' testimony was like a salty breeze coming in off the bay.
I would say that Bridges and the party line, I'm not hedging, by the way, but I would say that Bridges and the party line were very often parallel. I don't think Bridges ever followed anybody's line. I think Harry Bridges was one of the most independent thinkers I've ever met. Complex, independent thinker who, through a lot of guts, would stand up and say things and do things that most people would be afraid to do, or would be, if they were criticized, would back down. Bridges never backed down on almost anything. He didn't even back down in many cases when he really was wrong, as far as I'm concerned.
The government turned up 33 witnesses against Harry, and when Dean Landis wrote his opinion, it came to a little book, a small print government document, 210 pages or so, in which he analyzed in detail every one of those witnesses and his testimony, and discarded every single one, said not a single witness produced by the government was credible, though he ruled Bridges should not be deported, and the Secretary of Labor at that time said, okay, we're not going to deport him.
Although Bridges was vindicated, his enemies, which now included the FBI, launched a second trial in 1941. This time, the presiding judge, Charles Sears, found that Bridges had been affiliated with the Communist Party and ruled that he be deported back to Australia. Harry Bridges appealed his case to the Supreme Court, and finally, toward the end of World War II, they overturned the deportation ruling against him. One justice said, "The record in this case will stand forever as a monument to man's intolerance of man." Bridges then announced to the press that his next move was to get his prized possession, his citizenship papers. He almost didn't make it. His recently divorced wife, Agnes, provided an affidavit at his swearing-in ceremony, claiming that Harry had been a communist under another name. When the judge asked him if he was in fact a communist, Bridges once again denied it under oath. On August 9th, 1945, a few days before the Japanese surrender, Harry Bridges finally became a citizen of the United States. When the troops came home and war production started falling off, the ILWU leadership, which had a long-held belief that the Union should have full racial equality, had a new problem to deal with.
One night at Union meeting, I remember this very well. One of the old-timers asked Harry, when the war is over, what are you going to do about these black guys who have come here to take our jobs away from us? And Harry said, more or less, that he wished we had a system where we could have full employment for everybody, but if things reached the point where only 2 workers were left on the waterfront, if he was the one to make the decision, one would be a black man. I had never heard this kind of talk before.
Discrimination against Negroes is anti-labor, anti-American, and anti-white, Harry Bridges wrote in his monthly column to the Union. His progressive stand on racial, political, and social issues sometimes outraged conservative members in the ILWU. But despite obstacles, the ILWU had a reputation for racial equality, and it gave them a strong base of support in Hawaii among various ethnic workers in the sugar and pineapple industries, who were organizing despite strong opposition from an employer group known as the Big Five.
The Big Five in those days were throwbacks of the first missionaries that came over here. That there's an old saying in Hawaii: they came over to do good, you know, and they did damn well for themselves because they own all the land. They began to take over everything. They owned the sugar companies. They were the agents for the sugar companies, and the waterfront. They controlled everything. The workers were being exploited, and a lot of that was accomplished by bringing in different ethnic groups and keeping them separate and apart from one another, where they would play one group off against the other. And it was only until the ILW was able to pull all these groups together into one big union that we began to move forward. Whether you were a Filipino, a Chinese, or a Japanese, the union's position were all one, and we're equal in stature.
ILWU organizer Jack Hall did most of the hands-on work in Hawaii, and Lou Goldblatt did the negotiating. But whenever things reached an impasse, Bridges would fly over and tell the employers in so many words that if they didn't continue to arbitrate, he'd shut the whole damn island down.
I'm not afraid of the union's ability to defend itself. But you say, how are they trying to break the union? They'd be in there proposing a wage cut, as they proposed in sugar and pineapple, if the union wasn't strong enough and able to battle. As a matter of fact, last year in the sugar industry, they locked the union out to cut wages.
Well, we compel them to recognize the union. We're back of you, but that doesn't have anything to do with this present dispute. I'm asking how if this present dispute is any evidence of any intention to break the union.
Gosh, if you wait, listen, Senator, if you depend upon the law in Hawaii to get union recognition, you'll wait a long, long time. I've been in the courts in Hawaii. The first battle we had to fight in Hawaii against these same employers, and these employers stood up in the courts, and they said it's on the record. They said the Constitution of the United States doesn't apply to Hawaii. That's the first fight we had to put up in Hawaii.
Negotiating with Harry Bridges was both a joy and very frustrating. He was articulate, intelligent, loved to talk, and loved to talk about everything but the issues. He liked to show off his intelligence, his grasp of things, and very difficult to get him pinned down. He was always willing to put his reputation, his stature, even his physical well-being on the line. During the years when he had a serious problem with ulcers, we'd be negotiating in the islands, and typically he'd be there with a bottle of milk, and you knew he had some pain, and you knew he was in some difficulty. He never revealed that. He never let that interfere.
I never saw Harry carry a pencil. I never saw Harry with a piece of paper. But he would sit there, and when Harry would begin to make a delivery, the room got very quiet. Everybody listened, including the employers. One time we were in Sugar, where the employer was saying, yeah, but Harry, I mean, what do you need this for? Harry says, how the hell do I know? The workers told me they want it. That's it. You know, and he didn't elaborate and say, well, you know, it cost us so much for this, so much for that. He said, because the workers told me they need it.
Bridges' loyalty to the rank and file was personal and deeply rooted, and it drove the ship owners crazy. Even when we're wrong, we're right, he was fond of saying. In 1948, the ship owners decided to get rid of the two things that kept them from controlling the waterfront: the hiring hall and Harry Bridges. By using red-baiting tactics, they hoped to discredit Bridges' stature among his members, but it didn't work. When negotiations for a new contract broke down and the union called a strike, the stevedores, even the conservative members, closed ranks behind Bridges, and the strike was won hands down. It was a bitter blow to the employers, but out of that experience, a much more realistic element emerged from their group, which said in effect, the hell with politics. Let's try to get along with this guy.
I still belong to the school where you say to an employer, look, you're a nice guy, but here's the price. If you don't pay, you're going to get shut down. Because I've never met an employer yet, in all my experience. You go in there, and an extra penny of wages is 1 penny less of profits. So we have to get around that first. I remember when the employers used to sit down and argue with me, these ship owners around about it. It took us years to straighten them out. That they was really in business to give us jobs. They gave me that kind of a line. Look, get on your own side of the cockeyed table. I represent the workers. You're in business to make money. And when we agree on that, then we'll take it from there. After many, many years, they finally got around to that. It was called the New Look here. Mm-hmm. And a great man was heading the employees at that time, J. Paul Sancho. He's dead now, but he was a great man on the other side of the fence. That was the New Look when they agreed with us that their number one job was making money. After many, many years of trying to kid me that their number one job was to try to take care of me.
Although the employers were finally off his back, the government continued their pursuit of Bridges. In 1949, they claimed he perjured himself the day he was sworn in as a U.S. citizen, denying he was a member of the Communist Party. And so Bridges' third trial began. This time he knew the deck was stacked against him, in spite of 37 witnesses in his favor, among them a few guys from the other side of the table.
Harry surprised us all by a couple of employers coming up and speaking in his behalf. The feeling was that from the employers that Harry did bring stability to the waterfront, and that getting rid of him, the future was an unknown one. But at least with Harry, they knew how to talk to him, they knew how to settle issues and so on. And that's why they got up and defended him as the great statesman, the great labor leader, and so on. A little embarrassment for Harry, but he survived it, you know.
But could he survive the feverish climate of the Cold War? The trial had many of the trappings of a witch hunt. paid witnesses, ex-Communist Party members under the thumb of the Justice Department, a hostile judge, and of course, the FBI, as usual. Harry never lost a sense of humor when it came to the FBI.
He would type something, and then he would tear it up into small pieces, including the carbon paper, and then put them in a couple of different wastebaskets, and then wait for a while, and then come back to the room. Of course, everything was gone. And then he imagined these people trying to put these millions of little pieces together, carbon paper and all, to see what he'd said. And quite often it was kind of silly stuff. He might write poetry or just rhymes or something. He was playing games with them, but they weren't playing games. The FBI did bug him. They were on top of him. He lived in a goldfish bowl. No wonder he became kind of paranoid finally.
The judge commended the jury on their conviction of Harry Bridges. You have finally found the golden truth shimmering in the fiery crucible of the trial, he announced grandly as he sentenced Bridges to 5 years in jail. Harry was released on $25,000 bail while he appealed the conviction. He confided to his attorney, Vincent Hallinan, "Vince, if they send me to jail, I'm afraid I'll go insane." In June 1950, the Korean War broke out. It was a time in Harry Bridges' life when common sense should have told him to keep a low profile. And yet, while still on bail, he spoke out publicly against President Truman and the war. Even his own union opposed Bridges for taking this action.
In San Francisco, Harry Bridges is ordered to jail as a threat to the national security. The Longshoremen's Union president had been out on $25,000 bail since last April, when he was convicted of perjury for denying membership in the Communist Party. In the U.S. District Courtroom, the government, led by Special Prosecutor F. Joseph Donahue, charges that Bridges' activities since the outbreak of the Korean War have constituted giving aid and comfort to the enemy. Bridges denies the charges, but his bail is revoked. The Australian-born leftist faces possible deportation if he loses his appeal from the perjury conviction. Until then, the government is keeping in very close touch with Mr. Bridges.
The case went to the Supreme Court, and through their processes, Supreme Court Justice Douglas and the people that researched this whole effort said this man has the perfect right to say that this war is unjust, and he's not to be put in jail for it, so they reestablished bail. And then, actually, it was the stupidest thing they've ever done, because Harry came out a hero to his men.
Even those rank and file members who had a different political viewpoint, I think they loved him. They loved him because he was honest. He was fallible, but he was honest. He was honest. He was honestly committed to rank and file security and progress. He was honestly committed to seeing that the world became a better world for people to live in. And he preached that. When he had that stage, when he had that podium, that microphone, he simply let it come out of his heart and out of his mouth. And he took punishment for it.
When you were being represented as a communist, a scoundrel, a bogeyman, the scourge of the port, that didn't bother you?
No.
How did you hold on to what you knew yourself to be?
I had a bunch of guys down below that I represented, and if I made a mistake, and I made plenty and led with my chin, they'd throw me back into the ring, and they said, "Get it back in there, you stupid fool, and duck next time." So I had something going for me that way. A lot of other people didn't. I always had a rank and file down below. I knew I could always fall back into their arms. I made a mistake and explained it that way. They understood. So that's where I was better off than other people.
The government made one final attempt to get rid of Bridges, and in 1955, a fourth trial was held. But the presiding judge quickly dismissed the case, citing there wasn't a shred of evidence of Bridges' membership in the Communist Party. One observer at the trial reported that Bridges had tears in his eyes as the decision was read.
The truth of the matter is that all the evidence introduced against me in those trials by the government was 95% true. The technical point of being a member wasn't there. So this is where a lot of this stuff comes from.
What do you mean it was true? Were you sympathetic to communist causes?
Certainly, still am.
Were you a member?
No, that's the point. No. That's the technical point.
Well, if 95% of what the government introduced as evidence when it was trying to deport you was right,
yeah.
Were they right to try to deport you?
No. No. Finally, the court said that. When I say 95%, they... Isn't it true that you went down to your workers and say, tie up those ships and don't ship that scrap iron to Japan? That was a crime as part of the charges. Is it true that you served on a national committee with a known communist, Louis Weinstock, advocating unemployment insurance in this country? Yeah. And old age pensions, yeah. Is it true that you advocated industrial unionism and rank and file control? Yeah. Is it true that you advocate a Labour Party dedicated to the ownership and control of the means of production? I says, you're damn right, just like the post office. So all these things, guilty, 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 guilty.
Did you ever advocate the overthrow of the government?
No. But that's not the whole question. The question was always posed by force and violence. People and citizens of the United States have a right. It's in the Constitution. It's implicit in the Constitution, more or less in the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence, that when the government doesn't serve the people, they have a right to dump it, get rid of it, and get another government. But the thing that the zinger that was added, always was added in my case, that was the charge by force and violence. Not guilty.
And so, one of the longest inquisitions of any public figure in the nation's history had ended. But the struggles had taken a toll on his private life, claiming he's married to the Union, not to me. His second wife, Nancy, divorced Bridges. 3 years later, he married Noriko Sawada, who, along with her family, had spent World War II in an internment camp for Japanese Americans. When they tried to get married in Reno, Nevada, the couple was confronted with a Nevada law prohibiting intermarriage between Asians and Caucasians. Only after their fight to have the discriminatory statute revoked could Harry and Nikki marry. Harry Bridges now came face to face with a new opponent, one that he would find impossible to defeat. This enemy was not someone he could argue with or outwit or outsmart. It was a machine, the machinery of automation. He would have to make a decision. Would he fight the new machine and save jobs for his men, or would he move ahead with the new technology?
Ready to go?
Yes, sir.
Oh, all right. I had a prepared statement, fellas, but I threw it away and decided to speak off the cuff. The trade is highly competitive, and it can only continue with a certain amount of mechanization and maybe certain other changes. Our purpose, naturally, being a fairly selfish one. More work for longshoremen, and the employers naturally wanting to have more ships and carry more cargoes.
Bridges knew beyond all doubt that mechanization was unstoppable. His biggest problem was now convincing his membership to accept the inevitable fact. The days of handling cargo piece by piece, what longshoremen called hand jive, were gone forever. And with it, a way of life. Harry faced great dissension within the ranks from then on.
When I came to the industry, everything was break bulk. The hours were long when you worked. You paid a price for it with your body. Men were maimed, and many died early. When we began to mechanize a little bit, the work was much easier. But we just were not prepared to lose the jobs that we lost. And we wanted to keep it the old way. Bridges couldn't sell it, none of the other men could sell it. We talked about it in terms of modernization, but it was a hard sell.
All right, this morning starting on line 25. That's 8100, 8412.
In 1961, the Mechanization and Modernization, or M&M Agreement, was signed. It was one of the closest votes in ILWU history. Although the contract provided increased benefits for the longshoremen and guaranteed them 35 hours of pay a week, even if no work was available, the workers could see that down the line, jobs would be lost to machines while the flow of cargo increased.
There are some people who like to think or like to say that Bridges got too close to the employers toward the end of the line. Even people say that he sold out. I've heard, in fact, I once heard Louis say to Harry, I think you sold out on the M&M contract, the Mechanization and Modernization contract. And this whole idea that the Communist Party people around the Union even put out a pamphlet once, I remember it well, in which they said, Harry is guilty of collaborating with the employers, collaborating in effect then with the enemy.
I would argue with people who said that Bridges sold out. I would not argue with people who have said, as I think Link Fairley has said, that they settled cheap. I think they did settle cheap, but I don't think the employers snookered them. We didn't know how much that thing was worth. We didn't know how much those work rules were worth. Nobody had ever measured this.
Time magazine hailed Bridges as a great labor statesman who had successfully brought technology to the docks, while the Wall Street Journal called the plan a form of socialism. But within a few years, there was rebellion and disillusionment in the ranks. For the first time in 23 years, a strike looked imminent.
I'm not swearing. I don't want your mother to hear that.
Many of the young men wanted to become battle, get their scars in battle. They wanted their own chevrons. And there was no way that the leadership could appease them because they said, we want to take the employer. We have never been on strike. We've never had that kind of warfare. We want it. And they wanted to test their ability to take on the employers and to have it said that they've been through a strike.
The changes that had started to take place was beginning to have an effect upon the psyche of the longshoremen, if you want to call it that. And some of us just couldn't go along with that kind of a program. It was just that whole transition from the old waterfront where the emphasis was on the man as opposed to the new waterfront where the emphasis was on the machine. So that we were fast becoming an extension of the machine rather than the machine becoming an extension of us. And we started to do leaflets. And at first there was, because there was criticism of Harry in those leaflets, not attacks on Harry, because that was the one thing that we were careful not to do. We never attacked the person, we attacked the policy. So in doing so, we encountered a lot of hostility. Like I said, my father and I, we had knockdown drag-outs over the kitchen table. Matter of fact, he stayed away from my house for a long time because of his defense of Harry.
As things became more mechanized, and the employer said, we're not going to put a $100,000 piece of machinery here for some ham and egg to come along and bust it up and smash it up and do everything else with it. We want a responsible guy to handle it. And we think that guy, Joe Bananas, can handle it better than anybody else. And we want Joe Bananas to be the steady man in that thing. Well, the rank and file says, the hell with you. We're opposed to it. Because if you're going to take John Bananas today, you're going to take Joe Cornflakes tomorrow, and Charlie Soup Greens the next day, and pretty soon everybody's going to be a steady man. And we're going to have no need of a hiring hall. And the hiring hall was the cream, the whole essence of the union. So that's what the rank and file was afraid of. Lose the hiring hall, the union don't mean nothing.
You have to understand, a lot of people, you know, they have a job, right? And that's all they have. In some ways, to be a longshoreman, it becomes a state of mind and a state of being. So that you don't look at it as a job that I work for X company or Y company. You're a longshoreman, and you get your job out of the hall. And the boss is incidental to your employment. I mean, I work for Matson tonight, I work for APL the next night or whoever, and I'm through with them. But I'm never through with that hall. That's my lifeblood, you know. It's a place that, it's my second family, it's my second home.
Hey, Bill.
Bill, how are you? Are you smoking cigars and everything?
But he's smoking those little cigars. That means he's still working.
Yep.
What it boiled down to was that a steady man could bypass the hall each morning and report directly to a company peer. The majority of the union saw this issue as a threat to the sanctity of the hiring hall. And in 1971, it led to a strike. Bridges did his best to talk the union out of it, but it was no use. 96% of the membership voted to hang the hook.
Suddenly, the enemy is not the employer, it's Harry Bridges. And they made him the guy that was selling everybody down the river. And up to the point of the 71 strike, which he tried to avoid, as he tried to avoid every strike. They're a tough entity, and some of them you win, some of them you lose. You better be goddamn sure you're going to win before you start one.
We had people who stand there and call them names in the union meetings and talk about that hook-nosed so-and-so and they ought to go back to Australia and all that kind of stuff in our union meetings and personally insult him.
Having been called all sorts of names for so much of his life, it was now Bridges who was doing the name-calling, labeling his opponents hotshot radicals and super militants. It seemed he was continually looking over his shoulder, suspicious of anyone who did not agree with him. 2 months into the strike, negotiations remained deadlocked, and Bridges was summoned to a meeting with President Nixon. No agreement was reached. Nixon imposed an 80-day injunction, ordering the longshoremen back to work.
Automation.
They call it wireless.
The government, as they have in the past, will go to court and they'll ask the judge for an order. It's an injunction saying they're on strike and they can't continue to strike. That's the way it would seem to me. Then it's up to the court to get the people to obey that injunction. I hope the court doesn't depend on me, because I don't think I'd be able to do it. Because those workers, those ships are not going to sail unless those men decide they want to let them sail. Now, it's that simple.
It was the longest strike in ILWU history. Although Bridges had opposed the strike, he stood by those longshoremen who walked out, even when the strike ended in disappointment and defeat.
We had 100 and some days of strikes, and we came back. We had to accommodate 943, steady men. The men we were battered pretty badly, but we won. We kept the Union together.
Do you feel any stirrings down in the ranks of the younger members in particular about you and about the fact that you're 73 years old and the fact that you've been around a long time? Do you feel any pressures from them?
Oh, sure. They say the same thing as the press. He's old, mellowed, ain't the man he used to be. Used to be a good man once upon a time, but all those things are there. That's right, they say that. That's their privilege, too. So I got a simple question. Now, what's your idea? What should we do? Let's sit down and talk it over. But that's their right and privilege, and many of the younger people say that in this union and every other union. Oh, you're right. I'm 72 years old. It's time I got the hell out of the business. I know that.
But he would hang on for another 5 years, further alienating himself from longtime associates, splintering the leadership, convinced that people were out to unseat him. Some felt that he'd become so possessive of his beloved Union, they would rather the Union that was born with him die with him.
I worked for so many years so close with him, and I admired him, but I also was pretty aware of some of the realities of the man. And I give you an example. I was fired. I was not fired, basically. I was told, he said, I would like you to quit, just out of the blue. And I said, what do you want me to quit for? He said, because I have reason to believe that you're conspiring with my enemies. So I said, Harry, conspiring with your enemies? Who are your enemies? He said, hey, listen, you know. Boy, that's the perfect circle. You can't get out of that deal. That's a paranoid kind of a response. My enemies, and you know who they are. That's why I know you know. The thing was absolutely insane.
Harry had been at the helm of this union for over 40 years. Never been challenged, which I think is a mistake in any organization to have leadership that goes unchallenged. He then became protective of that leadership, of his own identity.
He was not happy about the direction of the Union after he left. And I suppose it was inevitable that he would feel that way, no matter if Jesus Christ himself had taken over the Union. That was the nature of the beast. It was a personal identification, and I think the people over the years, the rank and file, identified with him personally as the Union. I think that was a very unique kind of feature of that relationship.
It had been kind of a love affair, really, between Harry and his Union. And not all love affairs end well. Still, they had fed off each other in an intensely reciprocal way, Harry wanting passionately to get them everything they needed to live decent lives, and the rank and file trusting him to get it for them. And yet, for all the material gains he fought so hard for on their behalf, his legacy can't really be measured in those terms.
Hey, you got any more balls down?
No more balls.
Give me that balls down to Nancy. I'll be my own balls on that. I won't have anybody to tell me what to do. I got 34, gang, 34. Oh, here you go.
When you think about and had a chance to see all the people that I saw who had so little scholastically, so little materially, and then to see them progress in so many ways, and to know that all you had to do was answer your plug when it was called, and you spoke to the dispatcher out of courtesy. Good morning, Joe, good morning, Paul, or whoever the dispatcher was. And he'd ask you, where do you want to go? And you say, I want to go to Oakland Pier or Grove Street. And he'd give you your job, and you'd say, thank you, and they're on your way. And that was wonderful. All the years that I was there, I never saw any kind of payoff. You could stand tall and be proud of yourself and have dignity. And that to me was the greatest legacy of the IOW, what it did for a man's dignity.
It all seems so much more tame today, the labor movement.
In a sense, it's true, it's tame. The labor movement is legal today. A lot of times it wasn't. Organization is legal. Unionism is legal. Strikes are legal. Not too many years ago, that wasn't the case. The right to observe picket lines, we had to fight like hell around here. Can you imagine what this country was like when there was no welfare? No unemployment insurance? We'll go back a little further, no workers' compensation. These things are all relatively new. Welfare, unemployment insurance, food stamps. When you got out of a job in the old days, which is not too long ago, you know, you were just, what were you going to do? Well, if you didn't watch it, you'd starve to death in the United States of America.
Harry Bridges died on March 30th, 1990. The ILWU had made the transition to technology by then and is going strong today. In his last monthly column to the Union, he wrote, "I got to play a small part in some of the great events of the century, all because the rank and file of this union chose to elect me as their representative. My life, with all its ups and downs, would have been nothing without them."
Let me tell you of a sailor, Harry Bridges is his name. An honest Union leader that the bosses tried to frame. He left home in Australia to sail the seas around. He sailed across the ocean to land in Frisco town. There was only a company union and the bosses had their way. A worker had to stand in line for a lousy $1 a day. When up spoke Harry Bridges, us workers got to get wise. Our wives and kids will starve to death if we don't get organized. Oh, the FBI is worried and the bosses, they are scared. They can't deport 6 million men they know. And we're not going to let them send Harry over the seas. We'll fight for Harry Bridges and build the CIO.